Recently, I was reading Savitri, especially Book 1, Canto 3, and I was arrested by a beautiful passage. The first line is the absolute, the perfect, the alone. And when I read that line, I felt that really applies to Savitri as the epic. So I chose the title of my article today as Savitri, the absolute, the perfect, the alone. What do we mean by that? I started analyzing. Yes, it is absolute in the sense it's philosophy, it's metaphysics, concept of Brahman, concept of creation. All that is there in its absolute terms. And of course, perfection. Perfection in execution, perfection in poetry, perfection in its rhythm. And what we mean by alone? Well, we'll see when we come to that. But when we said about the absolute, it is the truth. Savitri deals with the high truth. You call it the Brahman, the supramental, whatever it is. But like the Upanishads, it is imbued with philosophic undertones. But let us be very clear that it is not per se a philosophic thinking, but it is a spiritual seeing. That's what makes it different from all other books of philosophy. And like the Vedas, it has a rhythmic speech which rises at once from the heart of the seer and from the distant home of the truth. So we see here a combination of the Upanishads and the Vedas. And of course, like in the Gita and the Upanishads, there are flames of a burning fire of mystic experience, waves of an inner sea of light and life, which really express a language and a cadence in these beautiful verses of Savitri. But I see that beyond the intellectual value of the word and its power of emotion, most of the verses of Savitri reverberate with soul suggestions. Now, instead of going on describing what this mantra is, because we can get its detail in the future poetry, but what I'm interested in is to see how these qualities of the mantric poetry apply to Savitri. So I've chosen this passage specifically, Book 1, Canto 3, beginning with the absolute, the perfect, the alone, and ending with the line, our life is a paradox with God for key. In the first reading of these 28 lines, we get a feeling of an overwhelming truth revealed from the heights of the mind. But the second reading, calmer and more inwardly receptive, shows that these verses are a splendid discovery, a rapturous revelation, a thing of beauty that is a joy forever. That's what I quoted from Sri Aurobindo himself. But what it means is that the poet enjoys truth as much as its beauty, the heights of spiritual realization, and its vast imprints of beauty in manifestation. We get the clear impression that the poet does not make a mere intellectual or philosophical statement of the truth. It is his vision of its beauty, its power, his thrilled reception of it, his joy in it that he tries to convey by an utmost perfection in word and rhythm. Even a philosophical statement is surcharged with a sense of power, force, light and beauty. Well, that being the nature of this passage, I would like to now take up the passage into three phases. The first one are the first 5 lines. I read out the lines. The Absolute, the Perfect, the Alone, has called out of the silence his mute force, where she lay in the featureless and formless hush, guarding from time by her immobile sleep, the ineffable puissance of his solitude. The Absolute is beyond the distinction of unity and multiplicity, and yet it is the one and the innumerable many in all the universes. He is alone, and when he desired to be multiplicity, he called out of the silence his mute force. This mute force is the Chit Shakti, the Aditi of the Vedas. Here we have to note what Sri Aurobindo is describing, that this Absolute called out of his silence his mute force, and then this force was really there in the immobile sleep, the ineffable puissance of his solitude. The first thing that the Absolute does when he wants to become the many is to call forth this mute force or this Aditi. And of course, these lines and this thought is not there in the Vedas, but Sri Aurobindo explained this in his small book, The Mother. And here is a passage that I read out from that book, chapter 6. The one original transcendent Shakti, the Mother, stands above all the worlds and bears in her eternal consciousness the Supreme Divine. Alone she harbors the absolute power and the ineffable presence, containing or calling the truths that have to be manifested. She brings them down from the mystery in which they were hidden into the light of her infinite consciousness and gives them a form of force in her omnipotent power and her boundless life and a body in the universe. You see, this is what Sri Aurobindo is describing and in Savitri and what he has written in the Mother are very, very close. In the lines of Savitri, it says, she lay in the featureless and formless hush, guarding from time by her immobile sleep. The same lines are here, that this presence, that this Mother, she calls forth those truths from the divine mystery. I mean, she is there, she is the person who knows what is the mystery behind, and what are the things to be manifested in this world. So she says, so Sri Aurobindo writes, that it's she who brings them out. She's kind of the midwife who knows what is to be brought out into manifestation and into the creation. So he says that it is this infinite consciousness which gives a form of force in her omnipotent power. Sri Aurobindo writes again that it is the Mother who is the transcendent, the original Supreme Shakti. She stands above the worlds and links the creation to the ever unmanifest mystery of the Supreme. The same word, links. Linking is there, what we see is the perfect thing. That's why we have in Savitri the same idea, that it is she who was brought out of the silence of the Sat or the Absolute, and it is she who brings out this time and space. So that is how she is the link. And therefore we see that the lower aspect, that means the second lines, the second 5 lines or 6 lines, they describe something of the second level, the second aspect. The first is the transcendent Absolute, the second is the universal Absolute. And what are these lines telling us? The Absolute, the Perfect, the Alone, has entered with his silence into space. He has fashioned these countless persons of oneself. He has built a million figures of his power. He lives in all who lived in his vast alone. Space is himself and time is only he. It's interesting to see that here the emphasis seems to be on this absolute, the Sat, the Brahman himself. In the sense, Sri Aurobindo says, it's he who has fashioned the countless persons of oneself. That means it is this aspect of the Supreme which has become the many, the multitude. And therefore he says, he has built a million figures of his power. Now, here is the link. Sri Aurobindo writes, he has built a million figures of his power. What is his power? His power is that mute self, is that mute force, is that Aditi. So in a way, it is the Supreme is manifesting himself, he is becoming the countless persons of oneself through the Aditi, through the mute self or the mute power. So who lives in all, who lived in his vast alone. That's true. He was alone, as we said, the absolute, the perfect, the alone. He was alone before manifestation, before creation. But once creation begins, he becomes the many. So he has become all these formless beings. He means, let us remember, it is he through the power of his mute power, that is mute Shakti, that is the Aditi Chit Shakti. We must always remember that whenever there is he, there is beside the he, there is a she. Because she, the Aditi, the power, who manifests. So the manifesting power is always the Aditi. We must remember that. So although he says, space is himself and time is only he, we have to remember it is not the space alone, that it is he, it is she who has become the space and time. Well, before we go further into this, when we read these lines, what comes to our mind is a beautiful verse, that what we call from the Vedas, the Nasadiya Sukta of Rishi Parishti Prajapati. And this Parishti Prajapati has given out these beautiful verses of Nasadiya Sukta, and I take out only one or two which are really relevant to our present explanation. It opens with these lines, these 4 lines. In the beginning that moved as desire within, which was the first seed of mind. The seers, having meditated in their hearts, discovered the connection of the existent in the non-existent. So we see here a beautiful line where it describes the beginning of the manifestation. In this beginning of the manifestation, we see how did it all begin. It was, first of all, there was a desire. That means the one wanted to become the many. So that's what the seer says is the first seed of mind. Well, here I bring in an explanation given by Professor Madhusudan Reddy. He says that in the Upanishads, Manas, whose basic quality is Kama, is described variously as Prajnana, Vijnana, Sankalpa, Manisha, Sankalpa Manisha, Kratu and Smriti. It is this faculty by which the one becomes many. It is the principle by which the immortal prana descends into the phenomenal world, by which Sat becomes Asat, and by which the immortal shares a common womb with the mortal. Well, again, the emphasis here is on the supreme divine, the Purusha aspect. The Purusha aspect becoming the many. But the reality is something else. But in Nasadiya Sukta and in the Vedas, always the emphasis is on the Purusha or the Brahman becoming this world. we see this explanation carries with it something different. With Sri Aurobindo, as we have seen in his own verses of Savitri, the Supreme called forth the mute force which lay in the featureless and formless hush, and is she who becomes time and space. In fact, in his booklet, The Mother, he clarifies that this is the great sacrifice called sometimes the sacrifice of the Purusha, but much more deeply the holocaust of Prakriti, the sacrifice of the Divine Mother. So this is where comes in the question of the mother becoming many. So there is a kind of a little difference between what the Vedic vision is and that of Sri Aurobindo. In the Vedas, the Upanishads and the Gita, it is always the Purusha aspect which has become this world. But in Sri Aurobindo, it is the Shakti aspect. It is the Chit Shakti which becomes this world. So kind of being is the Purusha, becoming is the Divine Shakti, the Divine Mother. So these are the second set of lines, the universal aspect. And now there comes a third line, a third section. But in the third section, what we see is the becoming of the individual. The universal, third level is the Brahman becomes the individual. Now the question is, why is there this passage from the universal to the individual? What was the necessity? Here we have a wonderful explanation from the Life Divine. What is the relation between the universal and the individual? What is the necessity of the birth of the individual? Why were this individual born? I'll read out the passage. The universe and the individual are necessary to each other in their ascent. Always, indeed, they exist for each other and profit by each other. Universe is the diffusion of the divine all in infinite space and time. The individual is concentration within limits of space and time. Universe seeks in infinite extension the divine totality it feels itself to be but cannot entirely realize. For an extension, existence drives at a pluralistic sum of itself, which can neither be the primal nor the final unit, but only a recurring decimal without end or beginning. Now this is a passage that we need to understand a little more closely. Look at the line from Sri Aurobindo. I reread. The universe and the individual are necessary to each other in their ascent. Are necessary to each other in their ascent. Not in this question of when there was an involution, but in the process of evolution, that means evolution of this world, of this manifestation, the individual becomes a very important feature, because it says, always indeed they exist for each other and profit by each other. Why? Because universe is the diffusion of the divine all in infinite space and time. It's like, if we say the clouds. The clouds are a vast mass of water. But if the clouds remain as clouds, there is of no use to the earth. We can have endless years of clouds, but until and unless we have the rain means the individual drops. So when we have the individual drop, then only the earth benefits. So similarly, he says universal is a diffusion of the transcendental divine. It's another form. But the individual is concentration within limits of space and time. So now the individual is required because it's the concentration of the universal. It's like the drops of water of the clouds. So these drops of water are much more important for the earth's growth, for the earth's evolution. Similarly, the individual as a concentration of the transcendent is of great importance, because it says, universe seeks in infinite extension the divine totality. It feels itself to be, but cannot entirely realize. You see, in the process of creation, the transcendent, the Brahman, became the universal is fine. But in the process of evolution, the Brahman wants to realize himself. What disseminate as the individual has to ascend and then get back in the evolution and return to the individual. For an extension, existence drives at a pluralistic sum of itself, which can neither be the primal nor the final unit, but only a recurring decimal without end or beginning. So this is the philosophy that we have to have the individual per se, because it is the individual who realizes the transcendent, not the universal. So it is not the question of the universal, the clouds becoming the supreme again. It is the individual drop which comes upon earth, which then gets evaporated and goes back to the level of the universal. And from the universal, the individual can even go further into the transcendent. So we see there is a very, very high metaphysical position of the individual. It's almost, I can say, mandatory, compulsory, that the transcendent becomes the individual if the transcendent has to realize itself in the evolutionary process. Otherwise, what's the use of this creation? The creation could have been halted at the level of universal. That means all the planets and the stars and what we call millions of billions of stars around here. But this whole creation, in the entire creation, the multiple Milky Ways we have, everywhere, Earth is the only place with individuals. Individuals, you can say on the moon there are individual rocks and individual mountains, individual forms. But we do not mean by individuals as little formations, but individual with a psychic being. As Sri Aurobindo calls here, in the line he would say that he lives in all who lived in his vast alone. He has fashioned these countless persons of oneself, and he has built a million figures of his power. That means the transcendent has become the individual. That means he has made himself available in the individual as the Atman, as the psychic being. So this is the need and necessity of the psychic being. Without the psychic being of the Atman, this evolution would have had no purpose. I mean, it would not have any kind of an end to it. It's no ascending end. So the necessity is there that we have to have this kind of a ascent, evolutionary ascent, and it's the individual who formulates that. So that is why we see in the third section, the line that we have just now read, the absolute, the perfect, the alone has entered into silence, into space. He has fashioned these countless persons of oneself. He has become the individual. And then we see that this individual, Sri Aurobindo writes in the same passage, in the conscious individual, Prakriti turns back to perceive Purusha. World seeks after self. God having entirely become nature, nature seeks to become progressively God. This is an imagery to tell us the same thing as I gave you the example of the clouds becoming the raindrops and the raindrops again returning to the level of the clouds. But in the human beings, not only the human being can become a cosmic personality, but he can even realize the transcendental divine. So that is the individual perfection, individual necessity. That's why in Savitri he would emphasize once again, then in a figure of divinity, the Maker shall recast us and impose a plan of Godhead on the mortal's mold, lifting our finite minds to His infinite, touching the moment with eternity. His nature we must put on as He put ours. We are sons of God and must be even as He. His human portion we must grow divine. Of course, these lines, if we read them by themselves, they do not seem to fit into this passage of the 28 lines. But here is a vision that Sri Aurobindo gives in a twist of sadhana. That's why these 28 lines that we are discussing are a summary of his integral philosophy and his integral yoga. It is by the process of yoga that we can return, as it says, we are sons of God and must be even as He. So we can return, we can become the children of this divinity, we can grow the human portion into divine portion only through sadhana. So here this passage is marvelous because of it's a combination of the integral philosophy and the supreme yoga philosophy of Sri Aurobindo. In fact, when we read these lines, His nature we must put on as He put ours, reminds us of the Bhagavad Gita, where the Lord says that we can attain the supreme divine by and become and have this 4-level mukti. What it says, Sayujya Mukti, Salokya Mukti, Sarupya Mukti, and Samipya Mukti. Now this is the possibility of the human individual, the human portion, growing into the nature of the divine. But in Sri Aurobindo, the process of growing into the divine is not any kind of a mukti or a sarupya mukti or salokya mukti. We can achieve this. But the process in Sri Aurobindo is very different. The process is what we call the triple transformation. The triple transformation is that of psychization, spiritualization, supramentalization. And then, of course, it is a long way to tell us what are these 3 triple transformations. But basically, is first of all to to realize the individual self, the psychic being, and then be governed by the psychic self in all its instrumental nature. That is, the mind, vital, and the physical must be governed by the psychic being. That is the psychicization. And the second level is the supramentalization, is the spiritualization, is that of the universal level, wherein we have the other aspects of the forces, the consciousness, the higher levels descending on the individual. That is the universal casting. And then the third level, the supramentalization, is the working of the supermind in the body. So in this body, if we have this question of the supermind, how is it working for transformation? So it's the supermind itself, its consciousness and power, which takes over the full transformation of the body, the mind, and the vital. So those are the 3 levels, which we need not discuss now for this paper. But that is the process of the individual turning into the transcendent. Now, having seen this, the absolute, the perfect, and the alone, from the point of view of philosophy, philosophical seeing, as it says, not philosophical thought. But then there is the other aspect which I have noted in the beginning. That is not just philosophical thought, but it is also the question of this thought being this thought being, put into a kind of a mantric rhythm. So there is this question of the expression. You see, a truth cannot be bluntly put forward. It's not a scientific truth. It's scientific truth which is blunt, it's prose, it's blunt, and it doesn't have any imagery, any symbolism. But when it comes to poetry, and especially mantric poetry, it has a different rhythm. As we say, so we see that this mantric rhythm is perfect in itself again. In Savitri, the form of beauty, the form of delight that has wrapped up these truths is in itself perfect. That is why now I apply the absolute is for the thought, perfection is for the expression. So we see here, the absolute alone is perfection. However, in the context of these verses, there is a different level of perfection. It is the perfection of the kind of poetry that captures the metaphysical vision of the absolute manifestation on the triple plane of existence. But then what do we mean by the perfection of poetry? To quote from Sri Aurobindo, there is the perfection of the language, and there is the perfection of the word music and the rhythm, beauty of speech and beauty of sound. So if this is what we mean by the perfection of poetry, by all means it is there in Savitri. That is to say, there is a beauty of word music and rhythm, beauty of speech, beauty of sound. So those of us who can get deeper into this external, the beautiful wrapping, as we say, the whole thing, it is this rhythm and this word music and these symbols and this imagery which lift up the truth, which kind of, penetrate. The truth is made to penetrate into our mind. The form becomes itself a vehicle for the content, for this truth to get itself transferred into a being. Otherwise, had it been just truth, scientific truth uttered in a blunt prosaic language, we would not have benefited. In fact, truth would have been too harsh, too blunt, too difficult to digest. But it is this perfection of the language and the imagery that really go to make this Savitri a divine form. So when we say that the sound rhythm of the first line of the selected passage, the absolute, the perfect, the alone, is almost meditative. Well, this is what I've seen. The thought may be clear, but let us practice and see how to read this line itself. If you just say the absolute, give it a pause. It's not run through. You say the absolute, the perfect, the alone. You see, even this repeating this line as it is gives you a really great amount of peace, a shanti, a kind of a meditative mood. So Sri Aurobindo purposely used just these three words, absolute, perfect, alone, without any interlinking, without any verbs and adjectives or anything, adverbs, anything linking each other. But there was a specific purpose. So he would say, the deliberate repetition of the line. We have seen this line is repeated 3 times. In a short passage of 28 lines, it's done 3 times. The absolute, the perfect, the alone. 5 lines later, again the absolute, the perfect, the alone. 8 times later, 6 lines later, the absolute, the perfect, the immune. You see, why has Sri Aurobindo repeated this line 3 times, almost 3 times, the same line? So that's where I wanted to find out. And Sri Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo being such a great poet and a kavi, it's not that he had no purpose in repeating these lines. In fact, when we dig into his literature, he wrote as a clarification to the critic, the repetition of the same ideas, he writes in a letter, the repetition of the same ideas, key images and symbols, key words or phrases, key epithets, sometimes key lines or half lines is a constant feature. Now, why is it a constant feature? They give an atmosphere, a significant structure, a sort of psychological frame, and architecture. Look at what Sri Aurobindo is writing. So it is not something, it is something faulty. From the point of view of the mental standards, we may say, hey, repeating the same lines in our literature, we are not supposed to do that. But Sri Aurobindo is telling us, no, in poetry, in high poetry, this is done with a tremendous purpose because they create an atmosphere. And as I said, if you read these lines, the absolute, the perfect, the alone, you repeat it a couple of times, it creates a kind of an atmosphere. And then a sort of psychological frame and architecture. There's an architecture, you see, from the transcendent to the universal, the individual. There's a wave after wave of new stages of creation that's taking place. So Sri Aurobindo writes, the object here is not to amuse or entertain, but the self-expression of an inner truth, a seeing of things and ideas not familiar to the common mind, a bringing out of inner experience. It's not that sometimes in songs and in all these things, we repeat a line more for an entertainment, even maybe to get back a rhythm. But Sri Aurobindo says no. The object of repetition is not to amuse the mind, is not to remind the mind. He says it is not familiar to the common mind, a bringing out of the inner experience. So it's a kind of the intended things to remind the reader, not mentally, but it's a kind of an inner vibration coming back. It's a kind of a phrase that gets back. And most important, Sri Aurobindo says this repetition is a self-expression of an inner truth. This is brilliantly put together because when we read it first time, the absolute, the perfect and the truth, and the absolute, the perfect and the alone, it gave us immediately a thing to say, hey, what is this absolute? What is this perfection? So it gives you a kind of an insight, an ingoing and in withdrawing into a kind of a truth. So we are in search of a truth. What is this absolute? So we have to go back to the Upanishads or the Vedas or the Gita or Sri Aurobindo and say, hey, what does it mean, the absolute? So you see, there is a search for an inner truth, a seeing of things and ideas not familiar to the common mind. Obviously, nobody would think of these three things together, the absolute, the perfect and the alone as together. So there's something uncommon. Now Sri Aurobindo further explains, he meant the poet, he uses avritti, repetition, as one of the most powerful means of carrying home what has been thought or seen and fixing it in the mind in an atmosphere of light and beauty. You see, this is the central thing. He says the poet uses repetition as one of the most powerful means. I never knew that this is one of the most powerful means that the poet uses for carrying home what has been thought or seen and fixing it in the mind of the reader in an atmosphere of light and beauty. So this is the crux of this passage. So the poet Sri Aurobindo, the Kavi Sri Aurobindo, uses this single line 3 times because of a different waves, and then he says he is bringing out a thought or something. It's a perfect thing. And here he says he is fixing it in the mind in an atmosphere of light and beauty. So this is the question of the light and beauty. That means, again, it is not a scientific truth, but each time he adds something to it, So that, as I told you in the beginning, it is this light and beauty of the form that helps us to digest, to invite, to understand, to imbibe the truth. So the perfection of the form and the absoluteness of thought, they have to go hand in hand together. That's what is happening here. And then Sri Aurobindo himself states here, this kind of repetition I have used largely in Savitri. You see, here is a poet who had all these intuitions. And we may be sure that here is a Kavi who has not used these lines from a mental point of view, saying, hey, let me repeat this line once again, it's a beautiful line, let me repeat it. It's not the question for entertainment. When he received these lines, as the Rishi of the Nasadiya Sukta must have received the whole thing as a vision, as a revelation, so did Sri Aurobindo receive all these lines in a point of revelation. But then when you go back, when you reread them, and then you see from the critical point of view, Sri Aurobindo also did this kind of a reading from the literary critical point of view. And then he says, yes, this is an avriti, a repetition that's very useful in poetry. And he must have found the similar examples. He said later on in Mahabharata and Ramayana also such things were used. So it has become a kind of a form, a format of great poetry. So this repetition is not to be blamed. It is on the contrary, if we understand, we begin to appreciate it. So the first avriti, the first one is the beginning of the transcendental. The first 5 lines. Second time when the line comes, the whole rhythm changes. It changes from the transcendental to the universal. So again we have 8 lines. After that again the third time the line is repeated, and then we have the creation of the individual. So you see, it is meaningful, even the division is meaningful. And in the third line, in the third section, the whole thing ends with a beautiful line where we say, all can be done, no, not all can be done. We see the line, our life is a paradox with God for key. A very simple line. There's hardly any imagery. There's no absoluteness of kind of a metaphysical truth. It's almost a line that is to be practiced in our day-to-day life. All this question of transformation, of yoga, of the change of nature, all the Sri Aurobindo described here in the previous lines. His nature we put on as he put ours. We are sons of God and must be even as he. His human portion we must grow divine. All this can be done, as we said, through yoga. But the most important thing in this yoga is our life is a paradox with God for key. So He is the key. It is in His name. If we can take His name constantly, aspire for Him for constantly, surrender to Him constantly, then alone this transformation, then alone this higher life is possible. Otherwise, the whole life will remain a paradox. There are so many contradictions that are taking place in this world, in this life. It will continue to be. It's God's creation, and it's God who has got the key hidden with Him. So Sri Aurobindo is telling us in simple lines, our life is a paradox. Because we don't understand the meaning, the method, the direction, why not, why problems, why difficulties. All the time we keep on having an amazing why. But all our bhakti movement, all our great yogis and sadhaks and devotees have taken the name of the divine. Because now we understand He alone, the divine alone, has the key. So that's why this line, this entire passage of 28 lines, which began with a high metaphysical tone, the absolute, the perfect, the alone, ends with the simplest of lines. Almost, a teaching in a classroom telling is, look at this, devotees, if you want to get away from all the difficulties, surrender to the divine, surrender to God. And God here is not necessarily, you can take it, you see, Sri Aurobindo did not use the word, our life is a paradox with divine for key. This is a very beautiful distinction. He purposely used the word God. Because divine could be somebody who is intangible. Divine may not have a form. It can be anything and everything. But for the sake of my life, I need a personal form. I need a personal Godhead. I need to see a Rupa, a form divine. So sure, the purpose it uses the word God instead of the divine. Although the meaning would be same. But for devotion, God as a form is important. Because we cannot have a devotion for a nirguna. The moment it becomes a nirguna aspect, then we lose this entire aspect of divine. It becomes into the mental level, mind level, where we see this question of meditation and all that. So it's a beautiful line summarizing almost this entire bhakti movement. All that the great saints have told us over the centuries is only this single line, that if you want to come away from the difficulties of life, God is the only key. Only key means we have to surrender as much as possible to this Godhead. And this God can be anyone whom you worship. It could be your own Ishtadevata. It could be anybody, any avatar or any form of the divine, anybody. Now that was the individual line on the level of the individual. And of course there is one line, one word which you may have noticed. Third time when Sri Aurobindo repeats the word, the absolute, the perfect, the alone. On the third time when he repeats, he doesn't call it the alone, he says the immune. Now that's again very interesting. Why did Sri Aurobindo change the word alone to immune? You see, on the level of the individual, there are so many things that can be affecting, that can be disturbing, that can be really, because the individual formations, the individual difficulties, the individual level of consciousness is so different that you can be attracted, distracted, disturbed. But somebody who is disturbed cannot be helpful to the individuals. That's why we often go to a yogi, a rishi, a great Mahapurush. Why do we go to that person for our difficulties? Because that person is immune. He is untouched by all these difficulties. He raises himself beyond this individual difficulties. So similarly, he says the absolute, the perfect, the immune. That means that divine who is immune in a way, and it is only the one who is immune can be most helpful. The one who is attached cannot give solution to the human attachments, to the human difficulties which come out of attachments. So it's a beautiful meaning there. Immune does not mean, he doesn't bother for you, that the divine does not care for you. No, on the contrary, we have seen even on the human level, if you want to help somebody, you have got to be beyond him, above him. So this above is above the human level of consciousness. So that is how Sri Aurobindo brings in the word immune. It doesn't mean it is not involved, but in the question of being above so that he can become involved in the human difficulties. Now the last word in this sentence, the perfect, the absolute, the perfect, the alone. And why did I apply this alone to Savitri? You see, we have seen the absolute is right because it's an absolute philosophy of the absolute. Okay, Savitri is nothing, the whole thing is a philosophy, philosophical seeing, not just a mental philosophy. Let's be very clear. It's a philosophical seeing of the absolute truth. Fine. Perfection we have seen, because one can go at a greater length. Perfection is the form, the mantric form, the rhythm and the rhyme and the word and the suggestion, the symbols, everything. It's perfect in that. That's why we call it a mantra. Mothers call it a mantra of transformation. A mantra, if it is not perfect in itself, if it has got loopholes and defects, it cannot transform, it cannot bring in the light, it cannot bring in the consciousness. So it is perfect. So Savitri, that's why Sri Mother would say, to read Savitri is itself to transform yourselves. To read Savitri takes you towards the psychic being. So it's that perfect in its purity, in its consciousness, in its vibrations, in its form, in its suggestions. So that we are justified. Now what about alone? What do I mean by the word alone applying to Savitri? That means, is it the best work in the field of epic poetry? Is it the best thing that mankind has ever produced? Well, for that, I cannot watch it because I have not read the entire literature of the world. And it may be very prejudicial if I keep on saying Savitri is the best book. For me it may be the best, but for you, who may have read better books. So the word alone applicable to Savitri is a bit tricky. So what I have taken here is taken from the mother's own description of Savitri. And I'll read out the passage. So says the mother, I've read so many things, but I've never come across anything which could be compared to Savitri. Some compared with Savitri. I've studied the best books in Greek, Latin, English, and of course in French literature. Also in German, and all the great creations of the West and the East, including the great epics. So here is a person who has a right to say something about Savitri, having read the entire world literature in different languages. So she is the person who is saying, I repeat it, I have not found anywhere anything comparable with Savitri. So this is the line that I wanted to quote. She alone can say Savitri is alone as the greatest masterpiece of the world. She says, what grandeur, what amplitude, what reality. It is something immortal and eternal he has created. So here we have the last word from the mother. He is something eternal, immortal, and here the Sri Aurobindo has created. I tell you once again, there is nothing like it in the whole world. So this is the sentence that really encourages me to say, Savitri is the alone. Is the alone because there is nothing like it in the whole world. And this is coming from the mother, because mother on a different level. Mother not the divine incarnation, but the person who has literally read libraries of books, read the Greek and the Latin and the German and the French and the Sanskrit books, and all the greatest of these books. And after reading all of them, she read perhaps Savitri the last. And then she says, I will tell you once again, there is nothing like it in the whole world. Even if one puts aside the vision of the reality, that is the essential substance, which is the heart of the inspiration. That's what we discuss as the absolute. That means the vision of the reality, the essential substance, his description of the reality of the world, of the creation of the world, of Brahman and all that. So that is the eternal substance. So the mother is saying, even if you take away the substance and considers only the lines in themselves, lines, as we said, the perfection. The perfect line, the mantric lines. She says, just take those lines. Even the substance is, of course, beyond most of these epics that have been created. The substance is so dense that is beyond all that. That says, delete that, you can suspend that. But take the lines, the mantric line, the powerful lines. He says, and considers only the lines in themselves. One will find them unique, of the highest classical kind. So it's the word mother uses herself, one will find them unique, of the highest classical kind. That word unique is where I bring in the word the alone. So you see here, when I read this explanation of the mother, I felt justified that when I started reading this passage, and then I said, the best description of Savitri could be the line taken from Savitri itself, the absolute, the perfect, the alone. And then this is where on the three levels, especially on the two levels, we can see Savitri is the absolute and is the perfect in its expression. Now, when we see this whole of Savitri in this marvelous significance and special significance, what comes out of this whole truth is again what Sri Aurobindo says in the first lines, when we read here. He called out of the silence his mute force, where she lay in the featureless and formless hush, guarding from time by her immobile sleep the ineffable puissance of his solitude. This is the silence we sink into. You see, you read especially these passages of 28 lines. I think this must be read in a very meditative mood and not a mental attitude. Because as I said, there's a specific rhythm that has been created. If you fall into that rhythm, you fall into quiet meditation. So that is the sum and substance of this passage. So when I started reading this, and when I got stuck with this passage, initially it was a thought, but then I saw its greatness in the rhythm, in the perfection of the language or the imagery. So I suppose this passage is one of the most unique ones in this entire 24,000 literature of Savitri. There are other inspiring passages. Each one of us can find better passages or different passages or more unique ones. But somehow this passage inspired me because I have a bent of philosophic mind, and here is a passage which has fulfilled my mind, my emotions, and the possibility of sadhana, and especially that line that all this, our life is a paradox with God for key. That has taken me very close to the mother, because for me that form divine, whose name and form are the solution to my personal life's problems, is the mother. So in a way, this passage has given me a tremendous fulfillment, an inner fulfillment, a meditative aspect, and a devotional fulfillment. So we have here both the Sri Aurobindo and Mother combined in this passage. The entire, from Vedas to the present times, we see a different passage. We see this unique passage. In the Vedas there was a different meaning, but there was a question of the creation. But Sri Aurobindo turns it completely into that of the creation done by the Mother, fulfilled by the Mother, and all of us individuals are forms of the divine consciousness for realizing the same supreme divine consciousness. Well, one can read more, perhaps you may find deeper meaning, you'll definitely find different meaning, but this is what I understood, and in the silence of my mind I have ruminated many a time, and here is a passage that is of great fulfillment, that gives me a joy forever, a beauty and joy forever, a thing of beauty, a joy forever. Here is that perfect passage. Thank you so much.